He smiled at his colleagues and gestured casually toward the woman refilling their water glasses. "Oh, that's just my housekeeper," Kwame said with a dismissive wave. "She helps keep things organized at home." The men laughed politely, returning to their conversation about quarterly projections and government contracts. Across the conference room, Adwoa's hand trembled slightly as she poured, but her face remained a mask of professional calm. She had learned over the past 6 months to swallow humiliation like bitter medicine, to let it settle in her stomach where no one could see it burn. What Kwame didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he performed for his colleagues in that glass tower overlooking Accra, was that in exactly 47 minutes, the Minister of Trade and Industry would walk through those doors, and the carefully constructed lie Kwame had been living would shatter like cheap glass under a hammer. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to where it all began, back to when Adwoa still believed that love could survive anything, even shame. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments because this story about pride, power, and the price of pretending is about to take you on a journey you won't forget. 2 years earlier, Adwoa Mensah had been a different woman entirely. She worked as a senior policy analyst at the Ministry of Trade and Industry, one of the youngest people to ever hold that position. Her office was small but positioned strategically 3 doors down from the minister himself, Mr. Kofi Asante, who had been her father's best friend before a car accident took both her parents when she was 19. The minister and his wife had no children of their own, and over the years, Adwoa had become the daughter they never had. They paid for her master's degree in international trade policy at the University of Ghana, celebrated her achievements, and treated her presence in their lives as a blessing rather than a burden. The minister called her his goddaughter publicly, and in private, he often said she reminded him of what his own child might have been. Adwoa had never taken advantage of this connection. She worked twice as hard as anyone else, arrived earlier, stayed later, and made sure every report she submitted was flawless. She wanted to earn her place, not inherit it through proximity to power. Her colleagues respected her, and those who didn't at least feared the quality of her work enough to stay quiet. That's where she met Kwame Hussein. He was a mid-level manager at a private consulting firm that had just won a government contract to assess trade policy implementation in the agricultural sector. The ministry assigned Adwoa as the government liaison, and from their first meeting, Kwame was captivated. Not just by her beauty, though she was striking with her deep brown skin, intelligent eyes, and the way she carried herself like someone who knew exactly who she was, but by her mind. She challenged his presentations, caught errors his own team had missed, and pushed him to think beyond surface-level solutions. Kwame found himself working hard just to impress her, and somewhere between policy briefs and project meetings, he fell completely in love. Their courtship was proper, respectful. He met the minister and his wife formally, asked permission to pursue Adwoa seriously, and promised to honor her always. The minister had been cautious at first, protective of his goddaughter, but Kwame presented well. He was ambitious, well-educated, spoke confidently about his future plans, and seemed genuinely devoted to Adwoa. When Kwame proposed after 10 months of dating, the minister gave his blessing with one condition. "She is precious to me," the minister said quietly, his hand heavy on Kwame's shoulder. "Not because of her connection to me, but because of who she is. If you ever make her feel small, if you ever diminish her light to make yourself shine brighter, you will answer to me, not as a minister, but as a father." Kwame had nodded earnestly, promising everything, meaning it in that moment. The wedding was beautiful but modest, exactly what Adwoa wanted. The minister walked her down the aisle, his eyes wet with tears, and Kwame's parents beamed with pride that their son had married so well, had connected himself to people of such standing. For the first year, everything was exactly as it should have been. They rented a nice apartment in Airport residential area, both working hard at their respective careers. Adwoa continued rising at the ministry, and Kwame's consulting firm was growing. They talked about children, about building something meaningful together, about the future spreading before them like a carefully drawn map. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, something began to shift in Kwame. It started with small comments. "You don't need to mention the minister so much," he'd say. People might think you only got where you are because of him. Adwoa would laugh it off, but the comments came more frequently. Then his company lost a major contract bid and Kwame came home angry, pacing their living room like a caged animal. They gave it to Mensah and Associates. Of course they did. Everyone knows the minister favors companies with certain connections. Adwoa looked up from her laptop. Mensah and Associates has an excellent track record. Their bid was probably just stronger. Kwame's eyes flashed. You would defend them. You would defend anyone connected to your precious godfather. The words hung in the air like poison. Adwoa closed her laptop slowly. What is this really about, Kwame? He turned away, shoulders tight. Nothing. I'm just tired of being seen as Mr. Mensah's goddaughter's husband instead of my own man. Something cold settled in Adwoa's chest. No one sees you that way. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. At ministry functions, people did gravitate to her first. The minister did introduce her proudly, and yes, Kwame was often added as an afterthought, and husband Kwame. She had never noticed how much that might sting. I'm sorry, she said softly.
Kwame didn't respond, just walked into the bedroom and closed the door with a control that somehow felt worse than slamming it. That night marked the beginning of the end, though Adwoa didn't know it yet. Over the next several months, Kwame's resentments grew like mold in darkness, spreading into every corner of their marriage. He stopped attending ministry events with her, claiming work conflicts or sudden headaches. When she was promoted to Director of Trade Policy Analysis, he congratulated her with a smile that never reached his eyes and got drunk alone that night while she celebrated with colleagues. His own career had stalled, his firm losing contracts while competitors thrived, and every loss felt like a personal attack, like the universe itself had aligned against him. He began staying late at the office, coming home smelling of beer and bitterness. And when Adwoa tried to talk to him, tried to bridge the growing distance between them, he would shut down or lash out. You don't understand what it's like, he'd say, walking into rooms where everyone knows you are connected to power. They don't take me seriously, they take you seriously and tolerate me. Adwoa tried everything, suggesting he apply for positions at international firms where her ministry connection wouldn't matter, offering to be less visible at events, even considering stepping back from her own career. But nothing satisfied him because the problem wasn't really about her success, it was about his pride. And pride is a wound that only festers when you keep picking at it. Then came the day everything changed completely. The day Adwoa's world tilted on its axis and never quite righted itself again. She was at a routine medical checkup, just a standard annual physical, when the doctor came back into the room with that expression that made her stomach drop. Mrs. Osei, the doctor said gently, sitting down across from her, I need to discuss your test results. 20 minutes later, Adwoa walked out of that office with a diagnosis that sounded like a foreign language, a rare autoimmune condition that was manageable with medication and lifestyle changes, but would require regular monitoring and treatment. It wasn't terminal, wasn't even particularly dramatic, but it was chronic and it was tiring, and it meant she would need to scale back her brutal work schedule. She told Kwame that evening, expecting concern or comfort or at least questions about what it meant for her health. Instead, he nodded slowly and said, So you need to stop working so much. His tone wasn't sympathetic, it was almost satisfied, like he'd been waiting for something to force her down to a level where he could reach her. I'll need to reduce my hours, Adwoa corrected carefully. Work from home more. The minister has already said I can restructure my role. Kwame's jaw tightened at the mention of the minister. Of course he did, he'd give you anything. The words were soft, but they cut deep, and Adwoa felt something inside her begin to crack. Over the next 3 months, as Adwoa adjusted to her new health reality, Kwame became someone she barely recognized. He started making decisions without consulting her, spending money they'd saved for a house on things he claimed were networking investments, a new car, expensive suits, memberships to clubs where young executives gathered. When she questioned him, he accused her of trying to control him, of thinking she was better than him because of her connections and her important government job. The final betrayal came quietly, announced casually over breakfast one morning, like it was nothing. I told my company I'll take the housekeeper arrangement off our benefits package, Kwame said, not looking up from his phone. We don't need it since you are home more now. Adwoa's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. What does that mean? He shrugged. It means you are home anyway, you can handle the house. Why pay someone else? Something in his tone, something dismissive and cold, made her blood run hot and then immediately cold again. "Kwame, I'm working from home because of my health, not because I'm unemployed. I still have a full workload." He finally looked at her and his eyes were flat, emotionless. "Then maybe you should decide what's actually important." That's when Adwoa understood, with sudden devastating clarity, that Kwame didn't want a partner. He wanted her to be smaller so he could feel bigger, wanted her diminished so he wouldn't have to grow, and there was nothing she could do or say or sacrifice that would ever be enough, because the problem wasn't her success, it was his failure to build his own sense of worth that didn't require standing on someone else's neck. She should have left then, packed her things and walked out the door. But illness has a way of making you doubt yourself, of making you tired in your bones. And she told herself she'd wait until she felt stronger, until her health stabilized, until she had the energy for the fight she knew divorce would become. So instead, she stayed, and she shrank, and she watched herself disappear piece by piece into the role Kwame needed her to play. When Kwame's company finally won a significant government contract, not through the Ministry of Trade, but through the Ministry of Infrastructure, Kwame was transformed overnight. Suddenly, he was hosting colleagues at their home, organizing dinners and strategy sessions, playing the role of successful executive with desperate enthusiasm. And that's when he started introducing Adwoa as the housekeeper. Not explicitly at first, just through omission and implication. He'd wave her away when he was meeting with colleagues, asking her to bring drinks or snacks, never introducing her, never explaining who she was. His colleagues would nod politely at her, thank her for the coffee, and return to their important conversations while she stood invisible in her own home. Adwoa told herself it didn't matter, that she was too tired to fight about it, that it was temporary. But humiliation has a cumulative effect, and each small degradation added weight until she could barely remember the woman who used to walk into ministry meetings with her head high and her voice confident.
Then came the day of the big presentation. The day Kwame had been preparing for obsessively. The day his company would pitch a major infrastructure development proposal to a committee that included representatives from multiple ministries. He'd rented a conference room in a luxury hotel, arranged catering, printed glossy presentation folders, everything designed to impress. That morning, Kwame's assistant called in sick, and in a panic, he turned to Adwoa. "I need you to come to the presentation," he said, his voice tight with stress. "Just to help with logistics, greeting people, making sure everything runs smoothly." Adwoa had hesitated, something in her gut warning her, but Kwame had looked so desperate, so close to falling apart, and despite everything, some part of her still remembered loving him, still wanted him to succeed. "Okay," she said quietly, "I'll help." What she didn't know was that Kwame had already made a decision, a calculated choice born of shame and fear and the desperate need to control at least one narrative in his life. When his colleagues began arriving, when they asked who the elegant woman organizing materials and ensuring everyone had refreshments was, Kwame smiled easily and said those words that would echo through the next hour like a curse. "Oh, that's just my housekeeper. She helps keep things organized at home." And Adwoa, standing across the conference room with a water pitcher in her hands, heard every word, felt them land like physical blows, and something inside her that had been bending and bending and bending for months finally snapped, not into anger, but into a cold, crystalline clarity. She was done. Done shrinking, done pretending, done allowing someone else's insecurity to define her existence. She set down the pitcher with careful precision, walked to the back of the room, and pulled out her phone. Her fingers moved quickly, typing a message she should have sent months ago, and as she hit send, she felt something like power returning to her body after a long absence. The presentation began, Kwame's voice confident as he walked the committee through projected timelines and cost analysis, his colleagues nodding along, occasionally glancing at Adwoa with polite disinterest as she stood quietly near the door. 15 minutes in, the conference room door opened and conversation faltered as everyone turned to see who had entered. Minister Kofi Asante walked in, flanked by two assistants, his presence commanding immediate attention, not through aggression, but through the quiet authority of someone who had earned every inch of respect he commanded. He was late 60s, gray-haired, wearing traditional kente cloth over a perfectly tailored suit, his face kind, but his eyes sharp, missing nothing. "Please continue," the minister said, gesturing for Kwame to proceed, but his eyes had already found Adwoa standing against the back wall, and something dangerous flickered across his features before his expression smoothed into professional neutrality. Kwame stammered through the rest of his presentation, suddenly nervous, his earlier confidence evaporating as he tried to understand why the Minister of Trade and Industry was at an infrastructure ministry meeting. When the presentation concluded, polite applause filled the room, and the committee members began asking questions, standard inquiries about implementation and sustainability. Then the minister raised his hand, and the room went silent. "Mr. Osei," the minister said, his voice pleasant, but with an edge that made several people shift uncomfortably. "The woman standing by the door, the one you've had serving refreshments and organizing materials while you presented to this committee, can you tell me who she is?" The room's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, every eye turning first to the minister, then to Kwame, then to Adwoa, who stood perfectly still, her face unreadable. Kwame's mouth opened, closed, opened again, his mind visibly scrambling for the right answer, for any answer that wouldn't destroy him. She's my wife, sir," he finally managed, the words barely audible. The minister nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the answer he'd expected and exactly the one he disappointed most. "Your wife," he repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "And yet, when your colleagues asked about her earlier, I'm told you introduced her as your housekeeper. Is that correct?" The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of traffic from the street below and someone's phone vibrating against the conference table. "There must have been a misunderstanding," Kwame tried, his voice desperate now, sweat visible on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "No misunderstanding," the minister interrupted, his voice still calm, but with a weight that made Kwame physically step backward. "I heard the words myself when I arrived early and stood outside this room. You called your wife, my goddaughter, a housekeeper. You reduced a woman with a master's degree in international trade policy, a director in my ministry, a woman who has advised presidents and negotiated treaties, to domestic help, because acknowledging who she really is made you feel small." The minister stood one step forward, and though he never raised his voice, his presence seemed to fill every corner of the room. "So my question, Mr. Osei, is not about your infrastructure proposal, though I assure you my colleagues and I will be examining it very carefully now. My question is this: why are you disrespecting my goddaughter?" Kwame's mouth worked soundlessly, his career and his marriage and his carefully constructed facade all crumbling simultaneously. And in the terrible silence that followed, Adwoa finally moved, walking slowly towards the center of the room where everyone could see her clearly, her head high, her voice steady when she spoke. "Uncle," she addressed the minister, "I think Mr. Osei is about to explain that to both of us."